Right, so today I want to talk about this story from True North News up in Canada, and it's titled Canadians Who Consume Mainstream Media Likely to Be Misinformed, Research Study Finds. And this, I mean, to me, it's not a shock whatsoever, and to most people who watch this channel, probably not a surprise whatsoever, but it's important because we're at the point in society nowadays that people who watch mainstream media are less likely to be informed. Like that's where we're at in society. That people a large percent of people who think that they're doing something to get informed are less informed than people who are probably doing less, work than they are, which is pretty insane if you ask me. But let's get into the article a little bit, and it basically starts right here. Over 1,000 Canadians were asked to participate in the study. They were asked to answer questions on basic policy. Respondents with high levels of traditional news media exposure reported uncertainty to the answer to our fact-based questions two fewer times than those who with lower levels of media consumption, says the report. They gave zero point 0.9 more correct responses. However, they also gave 1.1 more incorrect responses, which means they gave zero point 0.2 more net incorrect responses than those with lower exposure. At the same time, those who consume more of their news from social media are more vulnerable to misinformation. The one troubling point seems to be that while social media exposure is associated with higher levels of misinformation, so is exposure to traditional or mainstream media, though to a lesser extent. The report comes at a time when the Liberal government has pledged millions of funding to fight disinformation and fake news out of fear of potential interference in the upcoming election. However, the report found Canadians are still overwhelmingly consuming their news from traditional sources, which is helping spread inaccurate views about immigration, the economy, and the environment. And that was another story in and of itself, that the Liberal government in Canada is about as corrupt and inept as you can possibly be without people openly acknowledging them as so, because the mainstream media is very biased, very bad at their jobs, but yet the Liberal government of Canada has pledged $600 million. I mean, this is Canadian money. Imagine if Trump pledged 600 billion to Fox News and all these kind of things. Like, what would people say? But in Canada, people are perfectly fine with it. Like, it's a non-issue, and that if you're a news outlet, why do you need public funding? You should be able to make money on your own to fund your operation, because if you're a good media operation, you do good work, good honest work, you'll make good money. The problem is that outlets like the CBC are so horrible that they need government subsidies to keep going because they're so bad, and they have massive budgets, and yet they still do a horrible jobs. So I mean, that goes to show just what the Liberal governments and think about it is that, number one, they clearly don't know what they're talking about, because, I mean, anyone with half a brain knows the mainstream media is one of the worst outlets you can possibly get for getting your news. You'd be better off just not even paying attention to the news than getting your news from someone like the CBC or CTV or any of the Global, even any of the mainstream outlets, but especially CBC. And that if they want to fight disinformation, then they wouldn't give money to mainstream media. So what they really care about is misinformation and propaganda that favors their worldview or their political view. That's what they care about, and that um, all the mainstream media outlets in Canada are biased to the left, and I would say most of them, especially CBC, which is the biggest one, is so clearly and obviously biased in favor of the leftist worldviews that it's almost it would be if I was trying to make up a parody news site that was more biased to the left than the CBC. I don't even know if I could do a better job if I tried. Like, literally, that's just how biased they are to the left. They'd be comparable, or even to more of an extent, to how CNN is biased against Trump. Basically, that'd be the comparable way. But I would say it's maybe even worse, to be honest. Like, Canada is, because they don't get as much exposure up here as far as world news, the media and the Trudeau government and all that can get away with a lot more than someone like a Trump or that. But that is a different story in and of itself. The main point was that if you get the news from the mainstream media, I mean, you need to stop because you're being less informed. You're spending a lot more time doing it. Like, you can watch, 2 or 3 5-minute YouTube videos rather than watching your hour news uh, show that 90% of it is just filler or commercials when there's really only one or two noteworthy stories in there, and they're not even telling you the whole story with it usually anyways. Like, I don't know, I don't get why people, I mean, it's mostly older people, I mean, let's be honest, but it's also worse on the left in that the average Fox News viewer, there's this idea that the average Fox News viewer is just a super old white Republicans, but the average CNN viewer is actually older than the average Fox viewer, and that's for the simple reason that Fox does have some remnants of objective news. I would say stress a very small amount, but they do have some, compared to a CNN is like non-existent and it's not even close. So basically the main takeaway from this is that this is just more evidence on top of the massive amount of evidence we already had. The mainstream media is totally biased. All it is just propaganda, and that if you're watching it or anyone you know is watching it, you really need to stop. The problem is that if you know someone, it's probably going to be pretty hard to convince them otherwise, but I mean, maybe showing them a study like this would convince them, but it's tough with those kind of people because the one thing about the CBC and all these kind of, or the even mainstream media in general, is that they're good at propaganda. That's their full-time job. They get millions of dollars to do it, and they do a good job of it. They don't do a good job of giving you objective news, but they do a very, very good job of propagandizing people. And I think it's having the ability to propagandize people at the levels that are being done nowadays is something that, like the communists and the Nazis only dreamed of, because, I mean, the internet wasn't around back then. TV wasn't around back then. It was a lot harder to brainwash people nowadays. I mean, public schools weren't even nearly as relevant as they are nowadays. So it's scary to say, and I know a lot of people wouldn't agree with me on that, but the level of propaganda out there in society is at levels that we've only seen in communist and Nazi countries. So I'll leave it there. I don't want to talk too much about this issue. I think I got the point across pretty good, and that the big takeaway is the mainstream media is horrible, and just as we suspected, people who watch it are just propagandized sheep to the slaughter, basically, or just yeah, basically I'll just leave it there. If you like the video, make sure to hit that like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.